Behind the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, where centuries of royal secrets echo through marble corridors, a storm was brewing that would shake the very foundations of the British monarchy. It was a confrontation 25 years in the making, born from grief, betrayal, and the sacred memory of a princess whose light was extinguished far too soon. Princess Anne, known for her razor-sharp tongue and unwavering loyalty to family, had reached her breaking point. For years, she had watched in silent fury as Camilla Parker Bowles transformed from the other woman who destroyed her brother's marriage into the queen consort who now wore Diana's jewels and walked in her shadow. But when Camilla began using Diana's charitable legacy to boost her own public image, Anne's legendary restraint finally snapped. What happened next would send shockwaves through the royal establishment, expose decades of buried resentments, and force the monarchy to confront uncomfortable truths about love, duty, and the price of power. This is the story of a showdown that was always destined to happen, when the Princess Royal decided it was time to defend her late sister-in-law's memory against the woman who had once threatened to destroy it. In a world where royal protocol demands silence and diplomacy, and was about to prove that some battles are worth fighting, even if it means tearing down the carefully constructed facade that the monarchy has spent decades building. The morning mist hung low over Windsor Castle as Princess Anne strode through the ancient corridors, her riding boots clicking against the polished stone floors with military precision. At 73, the Princess Royal remained as formidable as ever, her steel-gray hair pulled back in her signature style, her jaw set with the determination that had carried her through decades of royal duty. But today was different. Today, the careful composure that had defined her public persona for half a century was about to crack. The catalyst had arrived just hours earlier in the form of a glossy magazine spread featuring Camilla, the queen consort, at a charity gala honoring children's mental health initiatives. The photograph showed her radiant in a stunning sapphire necklace, surrounded by young beneficiaries, her smile warm and maternal as she spoke about continuing the vital work that was so close to Diana's heart. The accompanying article praised Camilla's natural evolution into Diana's role as the people's princess, complete with quotes about how she felt honored to carry forward such an important legacy. And had read the article 3 times, each reading stoking the fire that had been smoldering in her chest for months. This wasn't the first time Camilla had appropriated Diana's charitable work for her own image rehabilitation. Over the past 2 years, since becoming queen consort, Camilla had systematically inserted herself into causes that Diana had championed, from landmine clearance to homeless shelters, always with carefully crafted statements about honoring her memory and continuing her mission. The irony was suffocating. The same woman who had been the third person in Charles and Diana's marriage, who had been secretly meeting with Charles throughout his engagement and early marriage to Diana, was now positioning herself as Diana's spiritual successor. And remembered the phone calls from Diana during those dark years, the tears, the desperate attempts to save a marriage that was doomed from the start because Charles had never truly let go of his first love. Anne's personal protection officer noticed her unusual agitation as she paced the length of her private study, her hands clenched into fists behind her back. Lady Sarah, her lady-in-waiting for nearly 2 decades, attempted to offer morning tea, but was dismissed with an uncharacteristic wave of irritation. The Princess Royal was known for her controlled demeanor, her ability to handle any crisis with calm efficiency, but something fundamental had shifted. The breaking point had actually begun 3 weeks earlier at a private dinner at Highgrove House. Charles had been entertaining a small group of close family and friends, including Anne, her husband Sir Timothy Lawrence. The conversation had turned to upcoming royal engagements, and Camilla had mentioned her plans to visit several homeless shelters in London, specifically referencing her desire to build upon the groundwork that Diana established in this vital area. And had felt her blood pressure rise, but had maintained her composure throughout the evening. However, as they prepared to leave, she had cornered her brother in his study. The conversation that followed was brief, but explosive, with and making it clear that she found Camilla's appropriation of Diana's legacy both inappropriate and deeply hurtful to Diana's memory. Charles, ever the diplomat, had tried to smooth things over, explaining that Camilla was simply trying to find her place within the royal family's charitable framework. But Anne had seen through the carefully constructed narrative. This wasn't about finding her place. This was about rewriting history, about transforming the woman who had been vilified as the marriage wrecker into a beloved figure who shared Diana's compassionate spirit. The magazine article was simply the final straw. The photograph of Camilla wearing jewelry that bore an uncanny resemblance to pieces Diana had worn during her own charity appearances was particularly galling. The styling choices seemed deliberately calculated to evoke memories of Diana, from the elegant updo to the soft, empathetic expression as she interacted with children. Anne's investigation into Camilla's recent activities revealed a pattern that went beyond coincidence. Camilla's team had systematically researched Diana's charitable portfolio, identifying the causes that had generated the most positive media coverage and public affection. They had then crafted appearances and statements that directly paralleled Diana's most memorable moments, right down to the settings and even some of the specific language used in speeches. The most egregious example had been Camilla's recent visit to an AIDS clinic in London. She had worn a simple white blouse and navy blazer, remarkably similar to what Diana had worn during her groundbreaking visit to an AIDS ward in 1987. The photos from Camilla's visit showed her holding hands with patients, embracing them warmly, in poses that deliberately echoed Diana's famous gesture of shaking hands with AIDS patients without gloves, a moment that had challenged public perceptions and helped reduce stigma around the disease. What made this particularly offensive, too, and was the knowledge that during Diana's actual AIDS advocacy work in the 1980s and 1990s, Camilla had been notably absent from any such causes. In fact, during that period, Camilla had been largely focused on her own social circle and equestrian interests, while Diana was revolutionizing royal charity work and using her platform to bring attention to marginalized communities. Anne's investigation had also uncovered communications between Camilla's staff and various media outlets, strategically placing stories that positioned her as the natural inheritor of Diana's charitable mantle. These weren't accidental parallels. They were carefully orchestrated campaigns designed to rehabilitate Camilla's public image by associating her with Diana's most beloved qualities. The morning after reading the magazine article, Anne called her brother's private secretary and demanded an immediate audience with both Charles and Camilla. The request was highly unusual and typically worked through proper channels and rarely demanded immediate access to the monarch. Her insistence that the meeting be scheduled within 48 hours raised eyebrows throughout the royal household. As Anne prepared for what would undoubtedly be one of the most difficult conversations of her life, she reflected on her complicated relationship with Diana. While they had sometimes clashed over royal protocol and Diana's increasing independence from traditional royal duties, and had come to deeply respect her sister-in-law's genuine compassion and her ability to connect with people from all walks of life. More importantly, and had witnessed firsthand the toll that Charles and Camilla's relationship had taken on Diana. She had seen Diana's transformation from a shy, hopeful bride into a confident, but wounded woman struggling to maintain her dignity while her marriage crumbled around her, and had watched Diana throw herself into charitable work partly as an escape from her personal pain, and she had admired how Diana had turned her suffering into a force for good in the world. The idea that Camilla was now profiting, both in terms of public relations and personal satisfaction, from work that had grown out of Diana's pain was unconscionable to Anne. It represented not just poor taste, but a fundamental betrayal of everything that Diana had stood for. Diana's charity work hadn't been about image management or strategic positioning. It had been about genuine human connection and a desire to use her privilege to help others. Anne's military background had instilled in her a strong sense of honor and loyalty, values that she felt were being trampled by Camilla's actions. As the only daughter of Queen Elizabeth II, and had spent her entire life in service to the Crown and the British people, she understood the importance of image management and public relations, but she also believed there were lines that should never be crossed. The night before her scheduled confrontation with Charles and Camilla, Anne made a series of phone calls to Diana's closest friends and some of her former staff members. The conversations were brief, but revealing. Everyone she spoke to expressed similar concerns about Camilla's recent activities, though most were too diplomatic or fearful of royal displeasure to speak publicly. Rosa Monckton, one of Diana's closest friends, confirmed Anne's suspicions about the calculated nature of Camilla's charity work. She revealed that several organizations that had worked closely with Diana had been contacted by Camilla's office, asking for detailed information about Diana's involvement, including specific strategies she had used and programs she had supported. Even more troubling was information from a former lady-in-waiting to Diana, who revealed that some of Diana's personal notes and strategies for charity work had been requested by Camilla's team, ostensibly for historical documentation purposes. The request had been granted by Charles's office without consultation with Diana's sons, William and Harry. Armed with this information, and felt vindicated in her decision to confront Camilla directly. This wasn't about petty jealousy or family squabbles. This was about protecting the integrity of a legacy that had meant everything to a woman who had died too young, leaving behind two sons who deserved to see their mother's memory honored rather than exploited. As dawn broke on the day of the scheduled meeting, and stood at her bedroom window, watching the grounds of her Gatcombe Park estate come alive with the morning light. Her mind was clear, her resolve absolute. She had spent decades navigating the complex dynamics of royal life, balancing personal feelings with public duty, but some principles were non-negotiable. The confrontation that awaited her would test every skill she had developed over 7 decades of royal life. She would need to be diplomatic enough to avoid creating a permanent rift in the family, but firm enough to ensure that her message was unmistakably clear. Camilla's appropriation of Diana's legacy had to stop, and was prepared to risk everything to make sure it did. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was about to defend a woman with whom she had sometimes disagreed, against a woman who was now family. But, for Anne, this wasn't about personal relationships. It was about honor, integrity, and ensuring that history remembered Diana for who she truly was, not as a convenient template for someone else's public image rehabilitation. As her car pulled away from Gatcombe Park toward what would become known as one of the most significant private royal confrontations in modern history, and knew there was no turning back. The careful balance that had maintained family harmony since Camilla's integration into the royal family was about to be shattered, and was the one holding the hammer. The atmosphere in the oak room at Clarence House was thick with tension as Princess Anne entered, her posture rigid and her expression unreadable. Charles had chosen his London residence for this family meeting, perhaps hoping that the familiar surroundings would help keep emotions in check. The room, with its warm wood paneling and portraits of previous monarchs, had witnessed countless royal conferences over the decades, but none quite like what was about to unfold. Camilla was already seated in one of the burgundy leather armchairs, her hands folded carefully in her lap, her usual confident demeanor noticeably subdued. She had been warned by Charles that Anne was particularly upset about something related to her charity work, but neither of them had anticipated the full scope of her sister-in-law's fury. Charles stood by the fireplace, his face grave as he watched and approached with the measured steps of someone who had rehearsed this moment countless times. The traditional pleasantries that usually marked royal family gatherings were conspicuously absent, and declined the offer of tea or coffee, instead taking the chair directly across from Camilla, her blue eyes fixed on the queen consort with unwavering intensity. The silence stretched for several moments before Charles attempted to diffuse the tension with small talk about the weather and recent family events, but Anne's sharp glance silenced him immediately. "I believe we all know why we're here," Anne began, her voice carrying the authority that had commanded respect throughout her decades of royal service. "So let me be direct. Camilla, your recent approach to charitable work has crossed a line that I find completely unacceptable." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and Camilla's carefully maintained composure flickered for just a moment before she recovered. Camilla had prepared for criticism about various aspects of her role as queen consort, but she hadn't expected such a frontal assault from Anne, who had always maintained a polite, if distant relationship with her. "I'm afraid I don't understand what you're referring to," and Camilla replied, her voice steady despite the obvious tension. "I've simply been trying to fulfill my duties and support causes that are important to the monarchy." The response only served to fuel Anne's anger. She had hoped that Camilla would at least acknowledge the problematic nature of her actions, making the conversation easier to navigate. Instead, she was being forced to spell out accusations that should have been obvious to anyone with a conscience. "Don't insult my intelligence," and shot back, her famous temper beginning to show through her controlled exterior. "We both know exactly what you've been doing," and reached into her handbag and withdrew a folder containing printed articles, photographs, and what appeared to be official correspondence. She placed it on the coffee table between them with a decisive thud that made both Charles and Camilla flinch. "This is documentation of your systematic appropriation of Diana's charitable legacy. The AIDS clinic visits, the homeless shelter appearances, the children's mental health initiatives. You've been deliberately recreating her most significant charitable moments, right down to the clothing choices and photography angles." Charles attempted to interject, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. And I think you might be reading too much into coincidental similarities. Camilla has every right to support the same causes that Diana championed. It shows continuity and respect for her memory. But, even as he spoke the words, Charles seemed uncertain, his eyes darting between his sister and his wife as if seeing the situation clearly for the first time. Coincidental similarities? Anne's voice rose slightly, her legendary self-control beginning to slip. Charles, do you take me for a fool? This isn't about supporting the same causes. This is about deliberately evoking Diana's memory for personal gain. Look at these photographs. She opened the folder and spread several images across the table. Here's Camilla at the homeless shelter last month, wearing almost identical clothing to what Diana wore in 1989. Here's her AIDS clinic visit, complete with the same hand-holding gestures that made Diana famous. And here, she said, pointing to a recent magazine spread, is your wife wearing jewelry remarkably similar to pieces Diana favored, while discussing continuing Diana's mission. Camilla's face had grown pale as Anne presented her evidence, but she maintained her defensive stance. Those are simply professional photographs taken during my official duties. I cannot control how photographers choose to capture my charitable work, nor should I be criticized for wearing appropriate jewelry to formal events. If there are similarities to Diana's style, they are entirely unintentional. The claim of unintentionality was the final straw for Anne. She leaned forward in her chair, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more threat than any shout could have. Unintentional? Do you really expect me to believe that your staff didn't research Diana's charitable portfolio? That they didn't study her most successful appearances? That they didn't specifically request information about her strategies and approaches from the very organization she supported? The accuracy of Anne's accusations hit their mark. Camilla's eyes widened slightly, and Charles turned sharply to look at his wife, clearly hearing about some of these details for the first time. The silence in the room became oppressive as the implications of Anne's words sank in. I have spoken to people who worked with Diana, and continued relentlessly. Rosa Monckton, her former lady-in-waiting, even some of the charity organizers themselves. They've told me about the request from your office for detailed information about Diana's involvement with their organizations. They've told me about the specific questions regarding her approach to media coverage and public engagement. This isn't about coincidental similarities, Camilla. This is about calculated mimicry. Camilla's defensive facade finally cracked, and anger flashed in her eyes. How dare you investigate my private charitable work? How dare you question my motives when I have done nothing but try to serve this country with dignity? Diana is gone, and the monarchy must move forward, and part of that means addressing the same issues that she cared about. Would you prefer that these important causes be abandoned simply to preserve some arbitrary distinction? The response revealed exactly the attitude that had so enraged Anne in the first place. Diana is gone, and repeated slowly, her voice dripping with disdain. Yes, she is gone. Murdered by paparazzi who were chasing her because of the circus that surrounded her personal life. A circus that you played a starring role in creating. And now you have the audacity to profit from her memory, to use her legacy as a stepping stone for your own image rehabilitation. Charles finally found his voice, stepping forward from the fireplace where he had been standing frozen. That's enough, and I won't have you speak to my wife that way. Whatever mistakes were made in the past, Camilla is now queen consort, and she deserves your respect. But his intervention lacked conviction, and both women could hear the uncertainty underlying his words. Respect, and turned her withering gaze on her brother. Charles, where was respect when Camilla was meeting with you throughout your engagement to Diana? Where was respect during those years when Diana called me in tears, asking if I thought her marriage could be saved? Where was respect when Diana threw herself into charity work partly to escape the pain of knowing that her husband was in love with another woman? And now you ask me to show respect while that same woman exploits the charitable legacy that grew out of Diana's suffering. The room fell silent again as the full weight of Anne's accusations settled over them. These weren't just complaints about inappropriate charity work. They were an indictment of decades of behavior that had contributed to one of the most painful chapters in modern royal history. Camilla's composure finally broke completely. You have never liked me, and from the moment Charles and I married, you've been waiting for an opportunity to attack me. This isn't about Diana's memory. This is about your personal prejudice against me. You've never forgiven me for the happiness I found with Charles, and you never will. You're absolutely right, Anne replied without hesitation. I have never liked you. But this isn't about my personal feelings. This is about the fact that you are systematically appropriating the identity of a woman who died because of the chaos that surrounded her marriage. A marriage that you helped destroy. Diana's charity work wasn't just professional obligation for her, Camilla. It was how she found meaning and purpose during the darkest period of her life. For you to now claim that mantle is not just inappropriate, it's cruel. Charles looked increasingly distressed as the conversation spiraled beyond his control. Diana's charity work will always be remembered and honored, but life must go on. Camilla cannot be expected to avoid every cause that Diana once supported. The royal family has a responsibility to continue serving the people, even if that means some overlap with previous initiatives. Overlap. Anne's voice rose again. Charles, this isn't overlap. This is systematic replication. Camilla isn't just supporting similar causes. She's recreating Diana's specific approaches, her visual presentations, even her language patterns and speeches. She's trying to become Diana, and that is something I will not tolerate in silence. And stood up abruptly, her folder of evidence still spread across the coffee table. I have one demand, and it is non-negotiable. This appropriation of Diana's charitable identity stops immediately. Find your own causes, develop your own approach to charity work, create your own legacy. But stop trying to wear Diana's mantle. It doesn't fit you, and it never will. Camilla rose to meet and challenge, her own anger finally, matching her sister-in-law's intensity. I have every right to support whatever causes I choose, in whatever manner I see fit. I will not be dictated to by someone who has been hostile to me from day one. My charity work will continue exactly as I see appropriate, regardless of your approval. The gauntlet had been thrown down, and stared at Camilla for a long moment, her mind rapidly calculating the implications of what would come next. She had hoped that this confrontation would result in some acknowledgement of wrongdoing, perhaps even an apology and a commitment to change approaches. Instead, she was facing open defiance and a clear statement that Camilla intended to continue exactly as she had been. Very well, and said quietly, her voice now carrying a deadly calm that was somehow more intimidating than her earlier anger. If that is your position, then you leave me no choice but to take this matter further. I will not stand by and watch you exploit Diana's memory for your own benefit. Charles stepped between them, alarm clear in his voice. And what exactly do you mean by taking this matter further? This is a family disagreement that should be resolved privately. Any public exposure of this conflict would damage the monarchy irreparably. And looked at her brother with something approaching pity. Charles, the monarchy has survived scandals far worse than this. What it cannot survive is the complete abandonment of honor and integrity. If Camilla insists on continuing to exploit Diana's memory, then perhaps it's time the public understood exactly what kind of person now holds the title of Queen Consort. The threat hung in the air like a sword over all of their heads, and was known for her discretion and loyalty to the family. But she was also known for her unwavering principles. If she felt that those principles demanded public action, no amount of family loyalty would stop her. As Anne gathered her evidence and prepared to leave, Camilla made one final attempt to defuse the situation. And surely we can find some middle ground here. Perhaps if we discussed specific approaches that you find problematic, we could adjust future engagements to address your concerns. But Anne was beyond negotiation. The conversation had revealed not just Camilla's actions, but her complete lack of understanding regarding why those actions were wrong. There could be no middle ground between honoring Diana's memory and exploiting it. The middle ground, Camilla, was respecting Diana's legacy enough not to appropriate it in the first place. That opportunity has passed. Now we move to consequences. And, with that, Princess Anne walked out of Clarence's house, leaving behind a royal family on the brink of a crisis that would test everything they thought they knew about loyalty, memory, and the price of ambition. The 48 hours following Anne's explosive confrontation with Camilla sent shockwaves through the carefully managed world of royal protocol and palace politics. Word of the meeting had spread quickly through the tight-knit network of royal staff, each version becoming more dramatic than the last as it passed from private secretary to lady-in-waiting to protection officer. By the second day, even the most junior staff members at Buckingham Palace were whispering about the royal war that was brewing behind closed doors, and had not been idle during this time. From her Gatcombe Park estate, she had systematically reached out to key figures in Diana's life, people who had witnessed firsthand the Princess of Wales's genuine dedication to charitable work and who understood the significance of what Camilla was now attempting to do. Her first call had been to William, Diana's elder son and heir to the throne, a conversation that would prove to be pivotal in everything that followed. Prince William had answered the phone from Kensington Palace, where he was reviewing briefing papers for upcoming royal engagements. His relationship with his aunt had always been one of mutual respect. She had been a steady, reliable presence during the turbulent years following his mother's death, offering practical support without the emotional drama that had characterized so many of his other family relationships. "William, I need to speak with you about something very important," and had begun without preamble, her voice carrying an urgency that immediately captured his attention. "It concerns your mother's memory and how it's currently being used by certain members of this family." The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour, with and carefully presenting her evidence and observations about Camilla's systematic appropriation of Diana's charitable approach. William listened with growing discomfort as his aunt described the calculated nature of his stepmother's recent activities, the deliberate parallels to his mother's most memorable charitable moments, and the apparent research that had gone into recreating Diana's strategies. What disturbed William most was the revelation about Camilla's team requesting detailed information about Diana's charitable work from organizations that had worked closely with his mother. He had not been consulted about these requests, despite being Diana's son and someone who took a keen interest in preserving her legacy appropriately. The idea that his mother's private notes and strategies were being studied for the purpose of public relations rehabilitation felt like a violation of her memory. "I've noticed some similarities in recent months," William admitted, his voice tight with controlled anger. "But I assumed they were coincidental. Are you telling me this has all been planned?" The question revealed the depth of his shock and disappointment. William had worked hard to maintain a cordial relationship with Camilla for his father's sake, but this revelation challenged everything he thought he knew about her motivations and character. Anne's conversation with William was followed by equally significant discussions with Harry, though reaching Diana's younger son proved more complicated given his strained relationship with the royal family and his residence in California. However, the gravity of the situation transcended their recent family tensions, and Harry listened with mounting fury as Anne described Camilla's actions. "This is exactly what we were afraid of," Harry said, his voice carrying across the Atlantic connection with barely contained rage. "We knew that once she became queen consort, she would try to rehabilitate her image using whatever means necessary. But using our mother's legacy? That crosses every possible line." Harry's response was particularly significant because he had been the most vocal critic of how the royal family had handled his mother's memory in the years following her death. The conversation with Harry also revealed additional information that strengthened Anne's case. Harry had been tracking similar patterns in Camilla's public appearances and had noticed the deliberate echoes of their mother's charitable work. He had even discussed his concerns with his wife Meghan before Anne's call, worried about how to address the issue without creating further family drama. Armed with support from both of Diana's sons, and then reached out to Earl Spencer, Diana's brother, who had delivered the powerful eulogy at her funeral that had criticized the royal family's treatment of his sister. Spencer's response to Anne's revelations was immediate and unequivocal. "This is disgusting beyond words." Diana's charity work came from her heart, from her genuine desire to help people. To have it turned into a public relations strategy for the woman who helped destroy her marriage is unconscionable. Spencer's support was crucial because he controlled access to Diana's personal effects, including private correspondence and photographs that documented her charitable work. He immediately agreed to provide, and with additional evidence of Diana's authentic motivations and approaches, material that would starkly contrast with Camilla's calculated mimicry. Anne's next significant conversation was with Rosa Monckton, Diana's closest friend during her final years. Monckton had been present during many of Diana's most difficult moments, including the period when she was trying to rebuild her life after her divorce from Charles. Their conversation took place over lunch at a discreet restaurant in Mayfair, away from the possibility of palace surveillance or media attention. "I've been waiting for someone to speak up about this," Monckton revealed, her voice heavy with emotion. Diana's charity work wasn't just professional obligation. It was her lifeline during the darkest period of her life. After the divorce, when she felt abandoned by the royal family and uncertain about her future role, those charitable activities gave her purpose and meaning. To see them now being used as a template for public relations is heartbreaking. Monckton provided, and with specific examples of conversations she had had with Diana about her charitable motivations. She described how Diana had deliberately chosen to work with stigmatized communities and unpopular causes, not because they provided good photo opportunities, but because she felt her position gave her the power to change public perceptions and improve lives. Diana told me once that her charity work was the only part of royal life that felt genuinely meaningful to her, Monckton recalled. She said that when she held hands with AIDS patients or hugged homeless individuals, she felt like she was finally using her privilege for something important. She wasn't thinking about media coverage or public approval. She was thinking about making real connections with real people. The conversation with Monckton also revealed disturbing details about recent approaches Camilla's staff had made to people in Diana's former circle. Several of Diana's friends and former staff members had been contacted by representatives claiming to be working on historical documentation of royal charitable work. The requests had seemed innocent enough, asking for memories and insights about Diana's approach to various causes. But in light of Camilla's recent activities, the true purpose became clear. Ann's investigation expanded to include conversations with actual charity workers who had collaborated with both Diana and Camilla. Dr. Margaret Thompson, who had worked with Diana on AIDS awareness campaigns in the 1990s, was particularly revealing in her assessment of the differences between the two women's approaches. The contrast is striking, Dr. Thompson explained during a carefully arranged phone call. When Diana came to work with us, she spent hours learning about the medical aspects of HIV/AIDS, talking to patients about their experiences, understanding the social stigma they faced. She came prepared with thoughtful questions and genuine curiosity. Her emotional responses to patients were authentic. You could see her genuinely moved by their stories. In contrast, Dr. Thompson described Camilla's recent AIDS clinic visit as professionally executed but emotionally hollow. She noted that while Camilla had hit all the right notes in terms of public presentation, asking appropriate questions, and making suitable gestures, there was a performative quality that felt fundamentally different from Diana's authentic engagement. With Diana, you felt like she was truly present with the patients, fully engaged in their stories and experiences. With Camilla, you felt like she was performing for the cameras, following a script that had been carefully rehearsed. The patients noticed the difference too. They were polite and respectful, but there wasn't the same emotional connection that Diana had been able to create. Ann's growing coalition of supporters was strengthened by an unexpected ally, Lady Sarah McCorquodale, Diana's sister, who had largely stayed out of royal controversies since Diana's death. However, Camilla's appropriation of Diana's charitable identity had compelled her to break her silence. Diana's charity work was deeply personal to her, Lady Sarah explained during a private meeting with Anne. She often talked to me about how these activities helped her find meaning and purpose during very difficult times. She wasn't doing it for public approval or media coverage. She was doing it because she genuinely cared about the causes and the people she was trying to help. To see that authentic dedication being copied for political purposes is deeply offensive to our family. Lady Sarah's support was significant because she had maintained careful relationships with all sides of the royal family since Diana's death, avoiding taking public positions on controversial issues. Her willingness to speak out about Camilla's behavior indicated the seriousness of the situation and provided Anne with additional credibility. As Anne's coalition grew stronger, word of her activities inevitably reached Charles and Camilla. The palace communications team was growing increasingly nervous about the potential for public exposure of the conflict, especially given the high-profile nature of Anne's allies. A confrontation between the Princess Royal and the Queen Consort was exactly the kind of internal family drama that could damage the monarchy's carefully maintained image of unity and stability. Charles made several attempts to contact Anne directly, hoping to negotiate some kind of resolution before the situation escalated further. However, Anne had moved beyond the possibility of private resolution. Her investigation had revealed not just individual instances of inappropriate behavior, but a systematic pattern of exploitation that she believed required public accountability. The turning point came when Anne received a call from Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's son from her first marriage. The conversation was awkward and tense, with Tom attempting to defend his mother while acknowledging the concerns that had been raised. "My mother never intended to disrespect Diana's memory," Tom insisted. "She's simply trying to fulfill her role as Queen Consort and support important charitable causes. If there have been similarities to Diana's work, they weren't meant to be offensive or inappropriate." But Anne was unmoved by Tom's diplomatic approach. "Intent doesn't matter when the impact is so clearly harmful," she replied. "Your mother has systematically appropriated Diana's charitable identity, and No amount of good intentions can excuse that behavior. The question now is whether she's willing to acknowledge what she's done and change her approach, or whether this will need to be resolved through other means. The conversation with Tom Parker Bowles marked the end of Anne's information-gathering phase and the beginning of her strategic planning. She now had support from Diana's sons, her brother, her closest friends, and several key charity workers who had witnessed both women's approaches firsthand. More importantly, she had documented evidence of the systematic nature of Camilla's appropriation and the calculated planning that had gone into recreating Diana's charitable identity. As Anne prepared for the next phase of her campaign, she knew that she was crossing a line from which there would be no return. The royal family had managed to weather numerous scandals and controversies over the decades, but this situation was different. It went to the heart of questions about authenticity, integrity, and respect for the memory of one of the most beloved members of the royal family in modern history. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would test not just the relationships between individual family members, but the very foundations of how the monarchy operated, and had built a coalition powerful enough to force change. But she also knew that using that power would come with consequences that would reshape the royal family forever. The question was no longer whether Camilla would continue appropriating Diana's legacy, but whether the monarchy itself could survive the public exposure of such calculated exploitation of a beloved princess's memory. The leak happened on a gray Tuesday morning in November, sending the British media into a frenzy that would dominate headlines for weeks. Someone within Anne's expanding coalition had provided detailed information about Camilla's systematic appropriation of Diana's charitable legacy to the Sunday Times, complete with side-by-side photographs showing the striking similarities between Camilla's recent appearances and Diana's iconic charitable moments from the 1980s and 1990s. The article was devastating in its thoroughness and impossible to dismiss as tabloid speculation. Written by veteran royal correspondent Sarah Bradford, who had covered the monarchy for over 3 decades, it presented a meticulously documented case that Camilla's team had deliberately studied and recreated Diana's most successful charitable strategies. The piece included quotes from charity workers who had worked with both women, highlighting the stark differences in their approaches and motivations. Within hours of the newspaper hitting the stands, social media exploded with outrage from Diana's supporters. The hashtag Diana Deserves Better began trending worldwide as people shared memories of Diana's authentic charitable work alongside images of Camilla's recent appearances. The contrast was stark and damaging, showing what appeared to be calculated mimicry down to clothing choices, jewelry selection, and even body language during interactions with vulnerable populations. The palace's initial response was a brief statement denying any intentional similarities and emphasizing Camilla's genuine commitment to charitable work. However, the statement was quickly overwhelmed by additional revelations that emerged throughout the day. Other journalists, sensing a major story, began their own investigations into Camilla's charitable activities and uncovered even more examples of apparent Diana mimicry. The most damaging revelation came from investigative journalist Tom Bauer, who revealed that Camilla's private secretary had specifically requested access to Diana's personal charitable correspondence from the royal archives. The request had been granted quietly by Charles's office, without consultation with William or Harry. This evidence of deliberate research into Diana's private thoughts and strategies provided smoking gun proof of the calculated nature of Camilla's approach. Prince William's response was swift and unprecedented. Breaking with royal protocol, he issued a personal statement through Kensington Palace that sent shockwaves through the establishment. The memory and legacy of my mother should be honored authentically, not appropriated for political purposes. Her charitable work came from genuine compassion and personal conviction, values that cannot be copied or replicated through strategic mimicry. The statement was remarkable not just for its content, but for the fact that the future king had publicly criticized his stepmother's behavior. Royal experts immediately recognized that William's intervention represented a fundamental shift in the family dynamics, and suggested that the heir to the throne was willing to risk family relationships to protect his mother's memory. Harry's response, delivered through a video message posted on the Archewell Foundation website, was even more explosive. Speaking directly to the camera with Meghan beside him, Harry delivered a passionate defense of his mother's legacy that left no doubt about his feelings regarding Camilla's actions. My mother's charitable work wasn't a job or a role, it was her calling, Harry said, his voice thick with emotion. She threw herself into helping others because she understood pain, because she had experienced isolation and rejection herself. To see her authentic compassion being used as a template for public relations is not just wrong, it's cruel to her memory and to everyone who loved her. The brothers' coordinated response suggested a level of planning and cooperation that surprised royal watchers, especially given their strained relationship in recent years. Their united front in defending their mother's memory indicated that some family bonds transcended even the deepest personal conflicts. Earl Spencer's reaction was equally forceful but more strategic. Rather than issuing public statements, he began working with documentary filmmakers and biographers to ensure that authentic accounts of Diana's charitable motivations would be preserved and publicized. He also announced that the Spencer family would be reviewing all future requests for access to Diana's personal papers, making it clear that material would not be provided for purposes that could be seen as exploiting her memory. As the story continued to dominate news cycles, additional details emerged that painted an even more troubling picture of Camilla's approach to royal life. Royal staff members, speaking anonymously to various publications, revealed that the Queen Consort's office had systematically studied not just Diana's charitable work, but also her fashion choices, speaking style, and even her approach to interacting with children and vulnerable populations. One particularly damaging account came from a former lady-in-waiting to Camilla, who described meetings where specific aspects of Diana's public persona were analyzed and discussed as potential models for Camilla's own presentations. The source revealed that Camilla's team had created detailed dossiers on Diana's most successful public appearances, including analysis of media coverage and public reaction. It wasn't just about supporting similar causes, the anonymous source explained. They were trying to figure out what made Diana so beloved and how to replicate that magic for Camilla. It was deeply cynical and calculated, turning genuine human compassion into a public relations strategy. The public reaction was overwhelmingly negative for Camilla and, by extension, for Charles. Opinion polls showed that approval ratings for the Queen Consort plummeted to historic lows, with many respondents expressing disgust at what they saw as exploitation of Diana's memory. More troubling for the monarchy was that Charles's approval ratings also suffered significant damage, as many people blamed him for allowing or even encouraging his wife's behavior. Protests began appearing outside royal residences, with Diana supporters holding signs demanding an apology from Camilla and justice for Diana's memory. The demonstrations were generally peaceful but emotionally charged, featuring enlarged photographs of Diana's charitable work alongside images of Camilla's recent appearances that highlighted the similarities. The international media attention was equally damaging, with major publications worldwide picking up the story and analyzing it as evidence of deeper problems within the British royal family. American television networks devoted extensive coverage to the scandal, often featuring interviews with Diana's friends and former staff members who provided additional context about her authentic charitable motivations. The crisis deepened when several prominent charities began publicly distancing themselves from Camilla's recent initiatives. The Terence Higgins Trust, which had worked closely with Diana on AIDS awareness, issued a statement emphasizing their commitment to authentic advocacy rather than image management. Similarly, Centerpoint, the homeless charity that Diana had championed, quietly postponed several planned events featuring Camilla. As the scandal continued to grow and found herself thrust into an unwelcome spotlight. While she had wanted to expose Camilla's behavior, she had not anticipated the level of media attention that would result. Reporters camped outside Gackham Park seeking interviews, while royal commentators debated her motivations and the appropriateness of her actions. Anne's response was characteristic. She refused all media interviews, but issued a carefully worded statement through her private secretary. The Princess Royal believes that the memory and legacy of Diana, Princess of Wales, should be honored with authenticity and respect. She has no further comment on this matter. However, the damage to royal unity was becoming irreparable. The scandal had exposed deep fault lines within the family that went far beyond disagreements about charitable work. It revealed fundamental differences in values and approaches to royal duty that had been papered over for years, but could no longer be ignored. Charles found himself in an impossible position, caught between loyalty to his wife and the growing evidence that her approach to royal life had been deeply problematic. Private meetings at Buckingham Palace became increasingly tense as senior royal advisors struggled to develop a strategy for managing the crisis. The turning point came when Catherine, Princess of Wales, made an unexpected intervention. Known for her careful approach to royal life and her avoidance of controversy, Catherine's decision to speak publicly about Diana's legacy was seen as highly significant. Speaking at a mental health charity event, Catherine delivered what many interpreted as a subtle but clear criticism of appropriating Diana's charitable identity. True charitable work comes from authentic compassion and genuine connection with the people we serve, she said, looking directly into the cameras. It cannot be replicated or recreated, it must come from the heart. While Catherine never mentioned Camilla by name, the timing and context of her remarks made their meaning unmistakable. The future Queen's intervention suggested that even the most diplomatic members of the royal family felt compelled to defend Diana's authentic legacy against what they saw as exploitation. The cumulative effect of these public statements and revelations created a crisis of legitimacy for Camilla that threatened her position as queen consort. Royal experts began speculating about unprecedented possibilities, including the potential for Camilla to step back from certain royal duties or even for Charles to reconsider her role within the monarchy. Public pressure continued to mount as more details emerged about the systematic nature of Camilla's appropriation of Diana's identity. The revelation that she had specifically requested Diana's private notes about charitable strategy was particularly damaging, as it suggested a level of calculated exploitation that went far beyond coincidental similarities. The crisis reached a breaking point when a group of Diana's former staff members issued a joint statement calling for Camilla to publicly acknowledge her actions and commit to developing her own authentic approach to charitable work. The statement was signed by people who had worked closely with Diana during her most difficult years, lending their intervention significant moral authority. We watched Diana pour her heart into charitable work that gave her life meaning during very painful times, the statement read. To see that authentic dedication being used as a template for public relations rehabilitation is deeply hurtful to everyone who knew and loved her. We call upon the Queen Consort to acknowledge what has happened and commit to finding her own path forward. As the fourth week of the scandal continued, it became clear that the situation had moved beyond the possibility of simple damage control. The public had been given a window into the calculated nature of royal image management that had shattered many illusions about the monarchy's authenticity. More importantly, the unified response from Diana's family and friends had created a coalition that could not be easily dismissed or ignored. The stage was now set for a resolution that would either see Camilla acknowledge her mistakes and fundamentally change her approach, or face the possibility of being permanently diminished within the royal hierarchy. The scandal had grown far beyond Anne's original confrontation and had become a test of the monarchy's ability to maintain public trust in the face of evidence that one of its most senior members had systematically exploited the memory of its most beloved modern figure. The resolution came not through dramatic public statements or palace announcements, but through a series of carefully orchestrated private meetings that would fundamentally reshape the dynamics of the modern monarchy. The crisis had reached a point where even the most senior palace advisors acknowledged that traditional damage control strategies were insufficient. Something more substantial was required to restore public trust and family unity. The decisive moment arrived when Charles himself requested a private audience with and at Windsor Castle, away from the media circus that had surrounded the royal residences for weeks. This time, Charles came alone, having made the difficult decision that his wife's presence would make meaningful resolution impossible. The king's willingness to meet without Camilla signaled too, and that he was finally ready to acknowledge the seriousness of the situation. The conversation took place in the same oak room where the original confrontation had occurred, but the atmosphere was entirely different. Charles appeared haggard and older than his years, the weight of the crisis having taken a visible toll on both his health and his confidence. For the first time since becoming king, he seemed uncertain about his ability to manage the challenges facing the monarchy. "And I owe you an apology," Charles began, his voice heavy with exhaustion and regret. "I should have listened to you from the beginning instead of dismissing your concerns as family politics. The evidence you've presented, the public reaction, the damage to Diana's memory, all of it could have been avoided if I had taken your warnings seriously." The apology represented a fundamental shift in Charles's understanding of the situation. For weeks, he had defended Camilla's actions as innocent coincidences or, at worst, overzealous enthusiasm for charitable work. But the mounting evidence and devastating public response had forced him to confront the calculated nature of his wife's appropriation of Diana's legacy. and listened to her brother's apology with the same careful attention she had brought to the entire crisis. While she felt vindicated by his acknowledgement of the problem, she also recognized that apologies alone would not be sufficient to repair the damage that had been done to Diana's memory or to the monarchy's reputation. "Charles, I appreciate your willingness to acknowledge the problem," Anne replied, her voice measured but firm. "But apologies are meaningless without concrete action. The public has lost trust in Camilla's authenticity, and that trust cannot be rebuilt through words alone. Fundamental changes are needed in how she approaches her role as queen consort." The conversation that followed lasted several hours and covered not just the immediate crisis, but broader questions about the monarchy's values and priorities. Charles found himself forced to confront uncomfortable truths about his own role in enabling Camilla's behavior and about the ways in which his desire to rehabilitate her public image had contributed to the exploitation of his first wife's memory. The breakthrough came when Charles proposed a solution that neither and nor the public had anticipated. Camilla would step back from all charitable activities related to causes that Diana had championed, and would issue a comprehensive public statement acknowledging her mistakes and committing to developing her own distinct charitable portfolio. "This isn't just about avoiding future conflicts," Charles explained. "It's about demonstrating that the monarchy still has the capacity for moral leadership and accountability. Camilla needs to show that she understands the seriousness of what has happened and is willing to make genuine sacrifices to address it," and was initially skeptical that Camilla would agree to such a substantial retreat from her established charitable work. The queen consort had invested significant time and resources in building her portfolio of charitable activities, and stepping back would represent a major blow to her public profile and personal ambitions. However, Charles revealed that he had already discussed the proposal with Camilla, and that she had reluctantly agreed to the changes after recognizing that her position as queen consort was at serious risk. The continuing public outrage, combined with the unified opposition from Diana's family and friends, had made it clear that maintaining her current approach was no longer tenable. The public statement that emerged from these negotiations was unprecedented in its directness and scope. Rather than the careful diplomatic language that typically characterized royal communications, Camilla's statement included explicit acknowledgement of her mistakes and specific commitments about future behavior. "I deeply regret that my recent charitable activities have caused pain to the memory of Diana, Princess of Wales, and to those who loved her," the statement read. "It was never my intention to diminish or appropriate her legacy, but I now understand that intent is less important than impact. I have failed to honor her memory with the respect and authenticity it deserves." The statement continued with specific commitments that went far beyond what most observers had expected. "I am immediately stepping back from all charitable activities related to causes that were particularly close to Diana's heart, including AIDS awareness, homeless support, and landmine clearance. I will be developing new charitable interests that reflect my own authentic passions and experiences, rather than attempting to continue work that belongs to Diana's legacy." Most significantly, the statement included an apology that many had thought would never come. "I apologize to Prince William and Prince Harry for the additional pain this situation has caused them. Their mother's memory deserves better than what I have provided, and I am committed to ensuring that my future actions honor rather than exploit her legacy." The public reaction to Camilla's statement was mixed but generally more positive than what the monarchy had experienced in weeks. Diana's supporters appreciated the explicit acknowledgement of wrongdoing and the concrete commitments to change behavior. However, many remained skeptical about whether Camilla would follow through on her promises or simply find new ways to appropriate Diana's legacy. More important than public opinion was the reaction from Diana's family. William issued a brief statement acknowledging Camilla's apology and expressing hope that her future actions would demonstrate genuine respect for his mother's memory. Harry's response was more cautious, but indicated a willingness to judge Camilla based on her future behavior rather than past mistakes. Earl Spencer's reaction was perhaps most significant because of his role as guardian of Diana's memory within the Spencer family. His statement praised Camilla's acknowledgement of her mistakes while emphasizing that actions will speak louder than words in determining whether this commitment to change is genuine. The resolution of the immediate crisis, however, revealed deeper consequences for the monarchy that would persist long after the media attention subsided. The scandal had exposed internal family dynamics that damaged the carefully maintained image of royal unity and had raised fundamental questions about the authenticity of royal charitable work. Anne's role in forcing the confrontation had elevated her status within both the family and the public consciousness. Previously seen as a dutiful but somewhat peripheral member of the royal family, she was now recognized as someone willing to sacrifice personal relationships and family harmony to defend important principles. Public opinion polls showed a significant increase in respect for Anne, with many people praising her courage in standing up to more senior family members. The scandal had also strengthened the positions of William and Harry, who had demonstrated their willingness to defend their mother's memory even when it created uncomfortable family tensions. Their coordinated response had shown a level of cooperation that surprised many observers and suggested that shared values around Diana's legacy might provide a foundation for healing their strained relationship. For Camilla, the crisis represented a fundamental recalibration of her role and ambitions within the monarchy. The charitable portfolio she had spent years developing was effectively dismantled, forcing her to start over and building a public identity that was authentically her own rather than borrowed from her predecessor. Perhaps more importantly, the scandal had established clear boundaries around Diana's legacy that would influence royal behavior for generations. Future members of the royal family would understand that attempting to appropriate Diana's charitable identity was not just inappropriate, but potentially career-ending. The long-term consequences extended beyond individual relationships to the institution of the monarchy itself. The crisis had provided the public with unprecedented insight into the calculated nature of royal image management and had raised questions about the authenticity of royal charitable work more broadly. However, the eventual resolution also demonstrated the monarchy's capacity for accountability and change when faced with serious criticism. Charles's willingness to acknowledge mistakes and enforce consequences showed that the institution still possessed the moral flexibility necessary for survival in a democratic society. As the immediate crisis receded, attention turned to whether Camilla would be able to successfully reinvent her public role. Her new charitable interests focused on literacy promotion and support for military families, causes that drew upon her own experiences as an army officer's daughter and lifelong book lover. Early indications suggested that her approach to these new areas was more authentic and less calculated than her previous charitable work. The relationship between Anne and Camilla remained formally correct but cool, with both women understanding that their confrontation had permanently altered the family dynamics. They appeared together at official events when required, but the easy camaraderie that had characterized some family gatherings in earlier years was gone forever. For Anne, the crisis had validated her decision to break with royal tradition and speak out about behavior she found unacceptable. While she had paid a price in terms of family relationships, she had successfully defended Diana's memory and established important principles about authenticity and respect that would guide future royal behavior. The scandal ultimately served as a watershed moment for the modern monarchy, establishing that even senior royals could be held accountable for behavior that violated public trust and family values. It demonstrated that the institution's survival depended not just on maintaining traditions and protocol, but on upholding moral standards that reflected the values of the society it served. Years later, royal historians would mark the Diana legacy crisis as a turning point that forced the monarchy to confront uncomfortable truths about ambition, authenticity, and the proper relationship between personal advancement and public service. The resolution had shown that while the royal family was capable of serious mistakes, it also retained the capacity for acknowledgement, accountability, and genuine change when faced with principled opposition from within its own ranks. Most importantly, the crisis had ensured that Diana's authentic legacy would be protected from exploitation, preserving her memory as someone whose charitable work came from genuine compassion rather than calculated image management. In defending her sister-in-law's legacy, and had demonstrated that some principles were worth fighting for, regardless of the personal costs involved.